events of the 1940s were World War II, which took place during most of the 1940s, the Warsaw Uprising, which was in 1943, the Germans surrendering was in 1945, and then when Pearl Harbor got attacked was in 1941, and the founding of the United Nations, which took place in 1945.
World War II is obviously the biggest and most well-known event from the 1940s. It was the deadliest war in human history, which is why there was more than 70 million deaths. And then the Holocaust was a big part of it too. And then the collapse of Nazi Germany. And the Allied leaders were Joseph Stalin, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill. Those are the good guys. And then the Axis leaders were Hitler, Hirohito, and Benito Mussolini. And now Braxton's dad, Michael Floyd, is going to tell us some personal experiences from his stepdad.
This is Michael Floyd, and he's going to tell us about a couple stories about his stepfather in World War II.
I am Michael Floyd, and my stepfather was Marion Clements, and went by the nickname Ducky. He got his nickname because he eventually got throat cancer from smoking too much, so he always had a raspy voice, so they called him Ducky, even when he was in his 30s. But in World War II, he was a gunner in a B-29. And so I had a lot of stories, but one of the stories they told me about was the day that they went on a bombing mission, and the only time that they didn't have enough air support was a time that they were shot down in the Pacific. And as their plane was going down, he had to get out of his gun turret, which is no little deal because they're very, very, very small, and you have to climb in. He was not a big guy anyway, he's about 5'8", and it was very small space that they climbed in. Sometimes it was a bubble underneath the plane, and he happened to be in that one. He was under the plane at the time, and so he had to get out as the plane was going down. He had to get out of the bubble, and with his parachute on, jumped out of the plane, and they had to wait in the ocean for, I believe, almost like an hour, hour and a half before planes came and rescued them. And so he had a lot of great stories. I'll tell you another one in just a minute. Another story, I guess you could say, is more like a how-to discussion or dialogue that I had with him. Was I asked him one time, I said, with so many planes flying around and you're in a firefight, and of course he's shooting a 50 cal machine gun, how do you keep from shooting your own planes, and how do you know exactly where the rounds are going? And he said those are good questions. And I remember him telling me that the guns are actually when you can only pivot so far, and there's like little blocks that maybe you haven't said, you can't just go 360 or not even 180. It's more like 110 degrees or something. I don't remember exactly, but when you get to a certain spot, there's a blocker that blocks the 50 cal to keep you from shooting down your own planes or going at a bad angle or whatever. And I said, well, how do you know where you're shooting? And he said, about every, and I don't remember exactly, but maybe 1 out of every 8 or 1 out of every 10 rounds is something called a tracer. And what it is, it's as your 50 cal is shooting, every 10th round or so is a little, it's not a round, it's not a bullet, it's a little fireball that's tracing. So as you're firing every 10 rounds, you're seeing tracers going to absolutely know where you're shooting. That way, if you know if you're behind a plane or in front of the plane that you're trying to shoot down. We can't find his jacket. I remember him having a fighter jacket, and I remember putting it on when I was 14, 15 years old, and I remember there were a bunch of planes across, and I asked, you know, what are all those planes? And he said, those are all the planes that I shot down. And if I'm not mistaken, there were 31 planes that he had shot down during World War II. And so we had great conversation. It was great to talk to somebody that was actually there and that was involved in firefights. And so that's all I got for
Fun fact, so the first McDonald's was opened in the 1940s. The Warsaw Uprising was the largest single revolt against Germany that the Jews did, and that contributed to the Holocaust, which we didn't mention as a main point in the beginning of the video, but it's still very important to the 1940s. And the Holocaust was a genocide during World War II, which Hitler's Nazi Germany killed 6 million European Jews. And Jews were targeted by the Nazis because they were not seen as the perfect race, or because they didn't believe the same as the Jews did. And the young children that were Jews were particularly targeted more because they didn't want them to grow up still believing to be Jews and to become stronger as a Jewish nation. Here's more on the Holocaust because it was one of the bigger events and it was the largest time span. And so the ways that they killed Jews in the concentration camps, which were in the Holocaust, were gas chambers, starving them, many diseases because there were so many of them in such close quarters, and sicknesses, and just awful living conditions overall. And the biggest concentration camp that happened during the Holocaust was Auschwitz, and it was obviously the largest, and it was known as the final destination for Jews. Some thought that they were going to make it out, that was where you got out, but that was where all of them were killed. And at this camp there was 865,000 Jews that were killed upon arrival that didn't even get a day more. And then 6,000 were gassed every day because they had 4 large gas chambers. And then Auschwitz is also a very big and well-known labor camp, so many died just from awful, terrible working conditions. And the Holocaust lasted 12 years, which is a huge time period that many, many Jews were killed. And September 15th, 1935 is when the Jewish people were pretty much taken out of society, and they lost all of their rights and citizenships, and then from then there the Holocaust just started and they were taken from their everyday lives.
Another fun fact is that the Jeep was created in the 1940s. So on December 7th, 1941 was Pearl Harbor, which was where Japan intended the attack as a preventative action to keep the U.S. Pacific Fleet from interfering with Japan's military actions. And we had 8 of the U.S. Navy battleships that were damaged and 4 were sunk, and then we had 188 of the U.S. aircrafts were destroyed, and 2,403 Americans were killed, and 1,178 were wounded. And then the surprise attack led directly to the entry into World War II.
The nuclear attacks that happened in 1945 were a result of Pearl Harbor. The U.S. dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, and they dropped them in the city of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the 2 bombings killed 129,000 people, and most of those were civilians, and those 2 bombs pretty much destroyed both of those cities because all of the toxic and harmful things that are in nuclear bombs. And to this day, this still remains the only use of nuclear weapons in the history of warfare, because we now know how much damage they can do. Whenever we dropped these on Japan, we didn't know how harmful and deadly they were going to be, which is why we now try to stay away from using nuclear weapons.
Now we have D-Day, which we didn't put in the beginning, but it was on June 6th of 1944, and it was the largest seaborne invasion in history, where the landing operations of the Allied invasion of Normandy took place from June 1944 to August 1944. 156,000 Americans, British, and Canadian forces landed on the beaches along a 50-mile stretch of the coast of France. Guess what else was made in the 1940s? Bikinis!
Now we have the founding of the United Nations, which took place on October 24th, 1945. And the UN was founded right after World War II ended. And it was just basically made to stop wars between countries. And it was also there to provide a platform of dialogue between the countries that would maybe help the process of stopping more wars. And it contains multiple smaller organizations to carry out their one mission of stopping major wars between countries. Another fun fact. Bugs Bunny made his first debut in the 1940s. Thanks for watching. XOXO. Aubrey, Cal, and Brax.